Hello, hello, hello. Welcome. Welcome into the virtual room, this wider space. And I'm on a very chilly, gray day on the west coast of Northern California. Whether you are watching live, and perhaps it's also morning for you, or maybe you're in a different time zone and it's afternoon or evening, or you're watching the replay at some point. But I welcome you into this space. And I'm trying something a little new, which is that I make notes before I talk, and it actually makes me more nervous. I think my habit, and the way that I tend to do these, is that I have an idea and I just show up and I just talk about it, which works relatively well. But in service of being able to offer a little bit more of like a coherent process as I speak, I take notes and then I get anxious about my notes. So that's where I am right now. And so I really want to talk about this piece. I get sometimes very directly, I get asked this question, and sometimes it comes out in other ways, but a really common theme, a really common inquiry, a common question, a common area of challenge that I see in people I work with that either come into my programs or workshops or that I come in contact with in the virtual space is really around this idea of there's so much emphasis on how do I create the relationships that I want. Again, whether they be intimate, long-term, sexual partnerships, or they be colleagues, professional relationships, family relationships, friendships, in all these different domains. There's like, okay, so how do I create the relationships that I want? And then there's, okay, but what about dynamics that are present in my long-term relationships? And again, when I'm talking about long-term relationships, I want to be really clear that I am talking about, long-term marriages, long-term partnerships, romantic, sexual partnerships, intimate partnerships, co-parenting. And I'm also talking about, long-term friendships, or even like long-term professional relationships. There's a woman on my team that I've been working with now for like 4 years, right? That's a long-term relationship. My best friend in the whole world, I've been friends with since we were babies. So we've been friends now for 43 years, right? That's a long-term relationship. Or other friends that I've had for 20 years, right? So these are all, what we're looking at is just where are these long-term relationships? Our families are long-term relationships. This process that I'm going to share does apply with family, and things are more complex with family. I want to just acknowledge that outright. But I want to be clear when I'm talking about long-term relationships, I'm really talking about the whole spectrum. So you can apply this where it seems relevant to you, or what pops up as relevant to you in this moment, and that bridges over into these other ways, these other dynamics that you might have in your life. So before I really dive into the content, I want to say again, of course, please bring your questions, your inquiries into the comments, whether you're here with me live, which is always awesome. I love the interaction when we're live. But even if you're watching the replay, I love the comments, just knowing that you're here, that you're watching, whether there's something you're like, yes, I totally get that resonates with my life, or like, hey, I'm not clear on that, or how would that actually apply here? I love all those inquiries, and I love to get to work with them. So please join me in the comments so that this can be a little bit more of a dialogue. So the first thing I want to say is we all have relational dynamics or patterns or habit patterns in long-term relationships. It's par for the course. It's part of the game. It's part of how it goes, is that the longer we're in relationship with another person or group of people, community, system, the more that we will get entrenched in certain ways of being or relating or habits or seemingly, quote unquote, the way things are. Well, that's just the way it is there. Well, that's how we do things. We are da 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 da, whatever that is. Anywhere in your life where there's some sense of that's just how things are, that's what I'm talking about. And it doesn't need to be negative or something you don't like. We can have things that's like, yeah, every Sunday we have brunch. They bring me breakfast in bed, da, 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 and I like it that way. So we have lots of relational patterns and dynamics that we're like, that's a relational pattern, and I like it that way. So with all of those, I say go on with your bad self. All the, dynamics, habits, patterns that are working for you, keep them. And I want to speak to the ones that you don't like, which is also incredibly normal, incredibly common. I hear this all the time. Everybody has them. Men have them, women have them, straight people have them, gay people, non-binary, queer, whether we're in intimate relationship or we're talking about friendships or business relationships. Like everybody has some relational dynamic in some relationship that they don't like, something that bugs you about that person, some habit that they seem to have, right? A thing they do over and over that you're like, I wish they wouldn't do that. Or again, something that just seems like it's the way it is and I don't like it. I wish it wasn't that way. So for instance, I hear a lot from women, mostly I think maybe men don't share these things with me, but sometimes actually, occasionally, but I hear from women like, oh, I have this group of friends, but all we ever do is like, will we always just go out and drink and talk about men or, relationships or sex or gossip or some, it's a little stereotypical, but I also hear it a lot. So, and this sense of like, do I have to leave that friend group? That's all that happens there. That's the way it is. And I don't really want to do that anymore. And then I often hear, so it feels a little like stuck. So this is exactly what I'm talking about, is these places where we think like, that's just the way it is. Do I have to change or do I have to leave? In intimate relationships, it can be like, the time of day we have sex, like, well, we're always having sex at night and I don't really like having sex at night. I like having sex in the afternoon. That's just the way it is. Like that's, or sometimes the way people will talk about this is that's the way it goes. Or like, it just got to be that way. There's this sense of lack of agency in it. Let's see, where we meet, again, this can happen with friends, this idea that it just like, well, we always go there, we always go to their place, or we always, like that's just the way it goes. Who cooks, who does the laundry, who takes care of the kids. These are all things that we can get into habits about. And again, if they're working, I say, great. And then sometimes we go like, yeah, but I don't like it that way. Or there's something else I'm wanting. So there is that piece of getting in touch with, well, there can be desire, right? Like I want it this way. Sometimes we know, or we can just know like, I don't want it that way. Or there's something I don't like about this. Communication styles, right? A lot of times that happens in business. Like, well, I guess it just goes that way because they're the boss, or this employee does things this way and like, doesn't really work for me, but it's probably just going to be that way. So these kind of dynamics, I imagine many of you, already have been like, oh, that sounds like ... in my life. That we all have them. Super, super common. And what this does in long-term relationships, again, it's on a spectrum. Sometimes these are really, really minimal, and sometimes they're like really grating over time, but ultimately they create resentment. When we have this thing like, it just always is this way and I don't like it. That's not how I want it to go. I wish it were different. I really like a different dynamic there, or some other flow of how we relate. That unaddressed over time, it can really erode at relationships, because ultimately it's like, why are we doing it that way? And I'm going to get to this in a minute, but often when something isn't the way we want it, but it happens over and over, we think, why are we doing it their way? And that's where the resentment comes. So I'm going to address that in just a minute, because that's actually a misconception or a misunderstanding about long-term chronic relational dynamics that we don't like. But it can really create resentment. And again, I see this in intimate relationships, but also in friendships or even in family dynamics, which is this sense that it becomes all or nothing. We get hopeless. Like, I guess it's just going to always be this way, so I might as well give up, right? That's the hopeless. I just have to put up with it. We see this in long-term relationships where people are like, well, I want to stay in the relationship. I like the person, but like, like totally doesn't work for me, but I guess it's just how it is. So like, is this one of those things I'm just supposed to put up with or compromise? Or is this what it means to be generous in relationship? It's just to pretend like I don't care about this when I really do. I'll talk about that at the very end. Or there's like, I guess I have to leave. Right. In that example with the group of friends, I hear that a lot in those dynamics. Like, well, that's just how that group of friends is. So I guess I have to find new friends. But also in relationship, right? Like certain dynamics really can become harmful in a way where if we build resentment, at some point we're like, fuck it all and I'm out of here. When this could really be addressed much earlier on. And it is true. So I want to say that we always have the opportunity to shift a long-term dynamic. The moment that we realize, like we may have been resentful for like 10 years, and maybe now you're hearing this and for the first time you're like, oh my God, I actually have been building resentment and I want to change that. So this is the moment, right? This is the moment for you. It's like that saying about, the best time to plant 20 trees was 20 years ago, but the next best time is today. So like the best time to have shifted that relational dynamic was 10 years ago, but the next best time is right now. So I want to say both of these together, which is that we can always shift the dynamic. The moment we realize that it's something we want to shift is the moment that you can then implement these 3 tips and tricks, these 3 steps that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And it is also true that the longer a relational dynamic or habit has been in place, the more challenging it can be to shift. It just has inertia on its side, right? So like it keeps going. And that's in both of or all of the people involved. There's a certain inertia. We have neuro patterns around it. We have habits around it. We, like the same ways that we tend to walk like the same paths or will drive the same route, even though we could go a different way. Like we just get in these grooves. And it is true that the longer it goes on, that there's a little more oomph that sometimes it can take to shift it because we just have habits. So the other thing why it's really important to put these steps in place is that the longer that we let something like this go on, it's just the more out of sync we are with that person. And if this is a dynamic that we want to shift, in some way, what's baked into that is I care about this relationship. This is actually a person that I love, or I care about, or I want to stay in relationship with for some reason. And so I have something at stake in the desire to want to work it out. And the longer that we go without addressing it, kind of the more out of sync we are. And the potential for that is that we end up kind of living in different realities. And over time, right, that's the classic example, of course, is like people who've been married for 20 years and then they wake up and they're like, who the fuck are you? Like, how do we even get here? And that's less about that people sort of the traditional, like we grew apart. It's more that we didn't stay in connection while we grew. So there's the idea that the solution to growing apart is that we grow together, right, in the same direction. But that's not necessary. 2 people can actually grow in separate ways or shift and change and be different. And if we stay in connection or relationship about where we're at, that doesn't always mean the end of the relationship in the form that it's in. We can be like, oh, wow, like you've really grown like that and you're still really amazing. And like you've really grown like that and I still want to be in relationship with you when we can stay in contact as we grow. So there's just, you can grow together and you can sort of grow together or apart and together and apart. Like all of these are possible, but I want to bust like that myth or misconception that we have to grow together in order to stay together. And again, I mean that about marriages, intimate relationships, friendships, long-term business relationships, our family, all of these things, right? So this is really key. So these are the 3 essential pieces, and what these will look like for each of you is slightly different. But in some way, and this first one is really key. So the first one is really key, is that when you discover, and again, it might not be that you didn't know that that dynamic was there, that there was something there, but like when it actually arises to consciousness to go like, oh, I don't like this thing. So when you discover that within any relational dynamic, the first step is to not assume that just because it is the way it is and you don't like it means that it must be the way the other person wants it. So for instance, let's talk about intimate relationship and like, well, for the last 5 years, you realize we've just gotten in this habit of having sex at night and I'm really tired and I don't like it. But that must be when they want to have sex because it is what's happening and I don't like it. And this is what do we call this? Like a fallacy, right? The fallacy is then to leap to the assumption, well, it must be the way they want it. And I think some of that is a positive impulse. It's like, well, I hope somebody is getting what they want in this dynamic. But the truth is, often it's not like that. Often the truth is that person over there is also going like, I guess this is when they want to have sex because that's what's happening. Like if we haven't really talked about it, right? So why this is so key is that it is so different to go to our partner, and this could be with a friend or a colleague, all these things, right? But it's so different to go to this person and be like, why do we always have sex when you want to have sex? Rather than, hey, so I've noticed that we seem to be in a habit, and this actually goes to the second one, which is getting shared reality, which is what I call shared reality anyway, within, is so I've noticed that we seem to be having sex at night, usually around, like after 10 o'clock. Do you notice that too? That's the first piece of shared reality is like, hey, do you notice that? And they might be like, no, we've had sex 10 times in the morning in the last month, right? Like they're really aware of that. And it's like, oh, right. So first we actually do need to find out, does it seem like the same thing, but not, it has to be about the objective experience, not the subjective one. So it's not like, hey, it seems like we're always having sex when you want to. Do you see it that way too? And they're like, no, we're not talking about the subjective. Is it the way you want it or the way I want it? Different example, just to pull it out of like the sexual or the intimate, is that my best friend and I, before COVID, we used to get together with our families probably like 6 times a year, like just about every other month. We would either go down to her house or she would come up to our house. And then there came this point where she checked in. It was basically that she, rather than just meeting at one of our houses, she would rather that we actually went like camping or backpacking or were out, because that's how she really likes to spend her time. But the first piece was sort of to check like, hey, so we always seem to be meeting at one of our houses and then we spend a lot of time inside the house. And I was like, yeah, that is how we do it. And she's like, yeah, I would rather we were outside, right? And it's like, oh, so now I know that that's true for her. But that first step is sort of checking, or if it's a communication style, right, in the workplace, like it seems like most of the emails that I get about, or most of the communications that I get about what needs to get done are emails that seem urgent and are right before something's due. Like, and then you first get shared reality about the objective piece of it. And then the second piece is that how, first of all, does it seem like that's true to you? But also, do you like it that way? Like, if it could be any way in the world, is that how you would choose it? And checking with the other person about that, rather than assuming that because that's how they're doing it or because it's happening between the two of you, it must be how they want it to be also. And so that first step of not assuming it's the way the other person wants it is huge, because it helps us to just go, oh, it's just not how I want it. It's not they're getting their way and I'm not getting my way, or it's always their way and it's never my way. And so now I need to like, get mine. Because that conversation, just a lot less fun. Let's put it that way. Like a lot less fun for everybody. Also a lot less effective. So then that piece of shared reality, like, hey, this is what I see, right? This is, if I just describe what I see as the lay of the land of this relational dynamic, and I'm curious if you like it that way. The sort of totally outside the realm of relational dynamics, the example that I like to give around this is like landscaping, because again, it makes it really easy to see, and it's totally outside the realm of the dynamic. Is like if you go out into your yard or your garden or the land you live on, and what you realize the dynamic is that you don't like. The thing you don't like is that there's this path that goes right this, and there's this big rock right in the middle of the path. And the first step is to just name, like, oh, so there's a path and there's a rock right here. And then the second step is, rather than going like, why the fuck did, my partner or the person I live on this land with, like, why the fuck did they put that rock there? Is to go to them and be like, hey, so I noticed that there's this path right here, and then there's this rock right in the middle of the path. And I'm just curious, do you like that rock there? And they might be like, no, I thought you put that rock there. Like, why the fuck would you think that? I hate that rock. Right. So rather than getting in that argument, it's just like, first you go, why, and then they're like, yeah, I love that rock, blah, blah, blah. Like, who knows, right? But you just get information about it rather than assuming they must have put that rock in that really unfortunate place. And maybe you've just spent the last, 6 months to 5 years, like walking around the rock. And every time you walk around the rock, you like curse your partner for putting the rock there. It turns out they didn't even put the rock there. Who knows how the rock got there? It's just like it arose. So, but once we go like, hey, do you like the rock there? Then we go into step 3, which is that you're able to collaborate creatively. And partly you get to collaborate because you're standing side by side looking at the rock, rather than, at opposing, like over the rock, like you put the rock there, you put the rock there, why the fuck's the rock there, right? And looking at the rock. And I also mean creatively, because actually it opens up the whole wide range. We're not just like, so how do we move the rock? Which might be the ultimate conversation, right? How do we move the rock? Well, when would you like to have sex? What other system can we set up around communication, around deadlines? What kind of conversation would you like to be having when we get together as friends, or where would you like to meet with your friends, right? All these things, it's collaborate creatively. But in the example of the rock, one of the things that could happen is that you both zoom out, right? And you look at the whole relational dynamic, right? That's the entire garden or yard. And you go, how do we really want things to be? And inside of that, you actually might realize that's the perfect place for the rock, and the path needs to move, right? So all the options become available when we first notice, like, I don't like it this way. And then we don't assume that it is the way the other person wants it. And then we bring it to them for shared reality, really checking like, hey, first of all, do you notice this thing? Second of all, is that the way you like it best? And then we go like, well, if sky's the limit, if all the options are open, how do each of us want things, and be willing to be in creative dialogue about how we actually want things to go in our relationship. Sometimes around the very specific, right? Like, well, it would really be helpful if I could get a phone call, and if email communications came within ... Like, oh, well, let's make sure that we plan family camping trips throughout the year, so that that's already in place, because I can't do a last minute camping trip. Like, that just there's no way I can plan for that, but I would love to make that happen within the ways that our family relates. Well, what else needs to shift, right, in the landscaping of our relationship in order for us to have sex in the afternoons, given that actually neither of us like to have sex at night, or they do like having sex at night, but they're like, hey, Now I hear that you like having sex in the afternoon. I want to make sure that also happens sometimes, right? It becomes a creative, collaborative conversation about all of the moving pieces such that we can start to put other things in place. And we're having that conversation collaboratively rather than at odds with each other. Like, why do you get your way? I want my way. Well, what do I have to give up? You always get your way, right? Which is at odds with each other. So one of the key pieces around this is this conversation of generosity. And I'm not going to go super into this, but it is one of the like foundations of all of my teachings. It's also one of the 4 pillars that I teach in Relationship by Design. One is desire, which I talked about before, like even knowing what we want or being able to notice that something isn't the way we want it and move into what we want. But then generosity. So I will often get the question like, well, how do I know if this is an area to try to shift or to be generous about? And the piece that I want to bring into this conversation right now is we actually don't even know unless you go through the first 2 steps here. Because, like, again, with the rock, if I think like, well, I'm just going to be generous and not mention the rock, first of all, it's not generous if we're building resentment. It's just not. Building resentment in our relationships is never generous. So if we are doing something over and over again, or not doing something over and over again, or withholding something over and over again that is building resentment, it is inherently not generous. But number 2, and this is also really key, is that that my walking around this rock and assuming it's generosity is based on the assumption that you put it there and you want it there. So I don't even know if my generosity is like actually an act of generosity unless I say like, hey, so I noticed there's a rock there and I wonder, first of all, do you see the rock? Second of all, do you like it there? And if they're like, yes, I like it there, then we can go, okay, do I want to be generous about that? Or is this something I want to work on? But we only even know that it is an area we could be generous about by checking. Is that, did they put it there? Do they like it there? Do they notice that it's there? And that is one of the things that came up with my best friend around this camping piece is that, I mean, I do like camping, but actually I really like it that our families get together at our houses. It's much easier for me. I would much rather with all the kids, like, and what they like to do, like, I would like it best if we were always at her. I would actually probably like it best if we were always at her house, but I would like it best if we're either always at her house or at my house. But because I love her, I love her so much. When she says, I really want to go camping with the kids, I'm like, okay, so now I know this is actually something that I can be generous about. But I don't even know that until we have the conversation about this is how things have been and who likes it what way and what might work better for one or some or different people in the dynamic. And then how do we go about that? And then I like go, okay, so what do I need to do inside myself so that I can be generous with her in this way? Okay, I need to plan in advance. Okay, I need to come up with a place that actually does work for me and my kids to be. Okay, but that's me being generous. And I'm happy to be generous when I know that that's something that is actually going to make a difference in the life of somebody I love. Not because I've just assumed that they want it that way. And by continuing to do it that way, like, okay, well, I'm just going to be generous and keep having sex at 10 p.m., even though I want to have sex in the afternoon. And then we find out actually they want to have morning sex. And then we've been or assuming that we're being generous for like 10 years and they're not getting what they want either. So that full stop. And I do want to say, if you want to dive even more deeply into what this looks like in all areas of your life with key fundamental teachings around designing our relationships, designing your relationships the way that you actually want them, having the tools, the practices, the communication processes that will help with these kinds of things, as well as regular live group coaching with me where we can talk about what is actually happening. What is the relationship that it's happening in? What did you say? What did they say? Like those kinds of things. I will be teaching a 10-week program starting in June called Relationship by Design Fundamentals. And it's basically taking all of the key fundamentals that I taught in last year's relationship by Design fundamentals, but then I saw how effective the tools and the fundamentals were last year, and what I saw is that they would be even more effective if I made the program 10 weeks, so that we could have like a visioning and an intention setting week at the beginning, a completion and celebration and integration week at the end, and then interspersed in those 8 weeks in the middle is 1 week of content and teaching, so that you'll get the teachings, the pillars, the fundamentals, the practices, get to put them into practice. And then every other week, we will have a live group coaching call where you can bring your questions, your inquiries, like what you tried, how it went, what you liked about it, what you're still confused about, and we can actually hash out, work with. I can give you tools like specific and unique to your life and your relationships for how to implement these processes. So we're going to open that up in May. The program actually begins in June. I love working with people in this way. So if you're interested in that, drop me a line and we'll make sure that you hear about it. Thank you so much. Thank you for your engagement live here. Thank you for any of the comments if you were watching the replay. And yeah, anything that comes up, I totally geek out on relationships. I want everybody to actually have the kind of relating they want to have. So just sending you lots of love and hoping that this is supportive. Ciao.